either managerial or public policy. You know, I mean, the question is, how does this matter? If I address this issue, how does it matter to the world? And we have, you know, crossed the stage where just too narrowly focused, even theoretically interesting papers, you know, get serious consideration for publication, unless they are important from a substantive viewpoint. You have to have a sound theoretical framework. Now, in the morning paper, I talked about continued ISUs, which clearly has serious managerial implications, because no business can survive, leave alone thrive, unless there is continued adoption and continued usage of its products. You've got to have a sound theoretical framework. I talked about this extensively in the morning. Professor Sheth also focused on this. Many of our panelists have focused on this. And one way is to integrate theories from other disciplines. I showed that in the context of our presentation in the morning, how we integrate theories from 4 different streams of research. The technology acceptance model, that was theory 1. And then we had belief updating mechanism, theory number 2. Self-perception phenomena by Bem, theory number 3. And then the role of habit, which is theory number 4. And integrated all these 4 theories into an integrated theoretical framework. Be ambitious, attempt a significant contribution. I am an editor, as well as I serve on the editorial review boards of several journals. And I find that the papers that are rejected because the authors, because of lack of contribution. And why there is a lack of contribution is because the authors have not been ambitious enough. I rarely can think of a paper I've recommended for rejection or rejected as an editor that was overly ambitious. Generally, in almost all cases, the author has not, or the authors have not been ambitious enough. What do I mean by that? For example, we integrated 4 mechanisms. Not 1, not 2, not even 3, but 4. Now, clearly, one could argue that 2 mechanisms, integrating them and presenting a integrated framework is a contribution. Yes, it is, but you know, it's a marginal contribution. It's not as much, is not in terms of significance as important as integrating 3, which is not obviously as important as integrating 4. So try to be ambitious enough in your research, then use an appropriate research design. Here, for example, in the paper that I published in the morning, we used a longitudinal design. Why? Because we are examining adoption over time, and not a cross-sectional design. Using cross-sectional design here and arguing that perhaps this is how it would project over time would not nearly be as convincing at all. Measurement is very critical. Use established measures for all your constructs. And even then, at this point was made by other panelists as well, it's incumbent upon you to establish the psychometric properties of your measures. And the very least, reliability, validity should be examined. And generally, you can do that by formulating and testing a measurement model. Use sophisticated data analysis. You know, folks, I'll be honest with you, while we may decry sophistication for the sake of sophistication, but I'll tell you this, if you write something, and although you may accomplish your objectives using a simple data analysis tool like regression, it's not going to be well received by the editor or the reviewers. There's a strong bias out there in terms of sophisticated data analysis. I just want to be blunt and honest about it. Here, for example, we use confirmatory factor analysis with autocorrelations. That, you know, considering autocorrelations considerably makes it much more complex in terms of estimation that is involved. We use a means of latent variable scores. We proposed 3 intermediate models I went and I discussed in the morning, 2 rival models. We examined the order effects. We examined non-response bias between both for wave 1, wave 2 of the questionnaire. We actually also looked at the common method variance, and this was the paper I published actually in 2006 in Management Science also, a very unique methodology for examining, estimating the magnitude and correcting for the common method variance bias. This is in December 2006 Management Science issue for those of you who might be interested. then you have to relate your findings to the theory. We showed here that the TAM model holds for initial use. This was the first demonstration in the information systems literature that evaluations are updated sequentially. And omission of feedback mechanism, which has been ignored in the past research, is problematic. And then, at least in the context of routine usage, past use may overshadow intentions in predicting future usage. So it's, you know, ultimately if you have to make a contribution to the literature, that is a theoretical contribution, you have to go back and tie your empirical findings back to your theory, which is why it's also very important to have a theory to begin with. Because if you don't, then you have nothing to go back to and tie to. Identify directions for future research. Here we did in this paper talk about high opportunity versus low opportunity behavior. We examined a high opportunity behavior context. It was student portal that student would use not only every day but many times a day, as opposed to low opportunity contexts like perhaps internet shopping that people would not do as frequently. And then we examined, you know, we said it's a longitudinal study, but we had really the minimum criteria for longitudinal study, i.e. data at 2 points in time. It could be easily extended to 3 or more waves. So it's a good idea to identify some directions for future research that you can share with the people. So I think the bottom line is that if you want to publish in a top journal, or if you want to do rigorous research, it cannot have any weak links. It has to be strong in terms of, you know, the problem you're addressing. It has to be strong in terms of theory. It has to be strong in terms of research design, which has to be appropriate. It has to be strong in terms of data collection, like Peter, I think, very eloquently brought out. It has to be strong in terms of data analysis. It has to be strong in terms of what interpretation, and it has to be strong in terms of linking your interpretation back to theory. It has to be strong in terms of identifying directions of future research that you are giving to others, you know, who are going to follow. So it has to be strong all the way through. And it's a good idea to try to build in all these contributions. And the more contributions you build in, the greater is the probability of it being published in a top journal, which, like I said, is one measure of how rigorous your research is. So with that, you know, as a session chair, I have to follow the guidelines I gave to the panelists, so I want to end there. But, you know, we have plenty of time for Q&A because, as we have found out even today, you people have questions, which I think is very good. And if you have the question as a general question, then you can pose it. And perhaps I can ask one of the panelists to respond. If you have a question for a specific panelist, then please address it to that panelist so that that panelist can then respond to your question. So who is the first one with a question? Yes, sir.
My question is to you.
Okay.
Since when we do research, we measure certain latent constructs and then we have pre-measuring variables as well. In those cases, we simply take some of the items as measured by other researchers in the previous journals or previous literature. How effective is that method? And second question is, if we are making any changes in the measuring items, to what extent do we know that we have to do the validity or the reliability check on the constructs now we are measuring with the changing items? A very typical example could be many people use TPB and TRA for measurement, and they simply make changes regarding wherever they are using TRA in a particular context. They pick up the items as proposed by Fishbein and Hazel and make the required modifications and use it without doing the validity checks. So your comments on that?
Okay. The two questions that you asked. First, you know, how appropriate it is to take items which have been developed by other people and apply them. I would say it is appropriate if you are using them in the same context in which they were developed and used. And if you are using them in a different context, then perhaps it may be more appropriate for you to go ahead and modify them. Now, your second question, whether you use the original items as they were originally proposed or you modify them, it is still incumbent upon you to establish the psychometric properties. That means show that your measures are reliable and that they are valid in terms of validity, examine at least the convergent and discriminant and nomological validity. That's the minimum that is expected, regardless of whether you're using somebody else's measures or you have developed your own.
And if I'm making just a language change in an item, for example, when I'm asking about the attitude change, attitude towards a product, the previous researcher has done it for, let's say, baby care product. I'm using it for automobiles. So my language has been twisted now. In those cases, how do we check? Do we need to check the validity and reliability again, or?
Absolutely. Even if you did not make any changes, still, your context is new. It's suddenly at a different time, different place, different setting. Still, it is incumbent upon you to establish the psychometric properties of the measures. Yes, please.
It's a general question, but regarding scales, measurement scales only. If I'm looking at researching on bottom of the pyramid migrant population, so after going through the theoretical underpinnings, and I have come up with the model, and I have standardized tools which have been used by other researchers and which have been well established. However, it's a very different context, very different kind of customer profile. I'm not talking about urban elite, migrant population in urban areas in India, but we are still talking about people who are from a very different kind of background, and it's very difficult to, even do 4 or 5 items per factor. So how do I go about data collection per se, both from the point of view of the tool as well as from the point of view of collection, data collection?
Okay. Peter, you want to respond to that? And the panelists, somebody else can add to that?
If I heard you, can you hear me? I think the microphone's on. If I heard you right, you're talking about differences between where the research was originally done and some of the issues where you now want to apply the same sort of measures and data collection methods. Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah, both from the point of view of the measure as well as the data collection approach.
I think it can be worthwhile to test what's already been used and see how that works and what changes you need to make. For example, I published a very interesting paper on social responsibility that was conducted in China. What they did was they took the standard social responsibility measures, which until then had been accepted worldwide as a measure for this area, and demonstrated that these measures just didn't work in China, that people just didn't understand the constructs upon which they were based. So what they did was they then tested alternative constructs which did apply in China and modified the accepted framework to account for that, and then tested these other constructs in other countries as well. So in a sense, they've moved on the whole methodology for measuring social responsibility based on the fact that they had to do something different in their particular country because the internationally accepted constructs didn't work. So that's, I think, one way that you can do that. Another one which I see all the time is the applications of ServQual. I do not want to see many more ServQual-based papers, no disrespect to that as a methodology. But what I see as simple replication studies in a given sector in a different country. The one that really grabbed my attention was a paper where the research was conducted in Hong Kong. And what they'd done there is they had again tested the original, found it wanting, modified it, tested the modified version, and then went with that. So demonstrating, again, that what can be well-accepted models in some parts of the world, particularly in the Western world, need to be adjusted before they can be applied in other situations. But they do provide that test, and that's the important thing. They don't just go ahead and do it because it didn't work. They did test it out rigorously to make sure that what they were doing really did make make sense. So, you know, that's, I hope, an answer to your question using those two examples.
Yeah, thanks. But that was, as I said, that was one part. So what your scenario? How about data collection? Especially as if I'm talking about bottom of the pyramid migrant population who have migrated from rural areas to urban areas because of unreliability of farming and foresthood. So they have moved to urban areas, and if I'm looking at collecting data from those kind of people where we have high literacy issues and communication issues.
You have to be innovative. You have to make sure they engage with the consumers and collect real, valid information from those consumers. So yes, you may have to change the methodology, and you may have to be very innovative to do that.
Let me give you an example of what Peter is saying. Suppose the original, constructs were measured on a 1 to 7 scale, Likert type of scales. Now, you know that these people do not have the necessary background to provide graded evaluations. So you may just want to use what is the simplest scale known, which is a binary scale. Do you like it or you don't like it? Yes or no? Rather than ask them to grade it on a 7-point scale, which they would not be able to do.
Then there would be challenges in data analysis with binary scale.
Yeah, but the point is this, that your methodology has to be appropriate to your target population. And you then worry about, okay, how do I go about analyzing the data in an appropriate way? I mean, your data collection is not guided by your data analysis. Your data analysis is guided by the data that you have.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
You need to try and access those, which may not always be easy.
Okay, somebody else? Yes, sir, they'll come to you.
Smile and things like that.
So this is a very basic question about context.
Is it a general question or to one of the panelists?
It's any of the panelists. It's about context. We talk about marketing is a context morning, and then we are talking about context this time also. But I have a question whether we can really define context in terms of some generic dimensions. For example, to me, if we can define a context by temporal dimension, spatial dimension, and climatic dimension, or I want panelists' reflection on that, because I read the papers, I understand they set up developing country context and developed country context, but thereafter not much I am able to comprehend. Sometimes I understand that cultural factors are different, that's why the consumption pattern is different, and so different things are there. But to just to give an example, I'm looking at issue of measuring corporate identity, and there is a scale developed in the case of new ventures, and a scale developed in the case of established organization in the hotel industry. But I am looking at the issue of measurement of corporate identity in the case of small and medium enterprises. What I found that small and medium enterprises have peculiar characteristics of entrepreneurial organization and established organization. And the existing skills are not capturing the sufficient domain of the universe which should be there. So I am confused what to do, what should be right strategy, and I am trying to understand context in that regard. So can you?
Any volunteers here? Steve.
There are a lot of ways to define context. In the paper that Professor Dash put up, my paper was Steenkamp, we tried to identify certain characteristics of emerging markets. In terms of the socioeconomic context, we talk about diversity, that is this bifurcated market with a few relatively wealthy people and many poor people. We talk about the demographics, the young populations versus old, the dynamics, the rapid pace of change. Any of these, just of that context, of those items that we identify, would take you to things like living standard measures or household income or simple demographic measures that could relate to those things. When you speak about culture, our countries are very high in embeddedness and hierarchy, so people accept that people will be in different places in society. Some people will be more responsible than others and have greater rewards, but that we are embedded in our social relationships. And when you start looking, say, for instance, to hero market low-income consumers, those social networks are driven together by socioeconomic circumstances. People have to behave in certain ways. They see themselves, if you look at the work of the Israeli psychologist Shalom Schwartz on values, you'll see in our work, I work with him, that we find in Africa that security is not a conformity dimension. It is actually self-transcendence. It takes on the meaning of being part of this collective and transcending oneself to help others. So when looking at context, the key that I would say is to look for the underlying assumptions of the theories that you are using and look where they were created and how do those environments differ from the environment that you're in. And from that, you can get cues, I think, as to what kind of variables might be interesting context variables.
And, you know, just applying what he said to your specific situation, first of all, you need to have a theory of corporate identity, have an understanding, some strong conceptual theoretical underpinnings of what is corporate identity. And then based on that, you can say, okay, how is corporate identity in SMEs different from the corporate identity of entrepreneurial or well-established firms? And then based on that, then you say, okay, these are the dimensions on how it will differ. And then based on that, perhaps what you may want to do is draw certain items from entrepreneurial firms, certain set of scales, look at the scale measured, used to measure corporate identity for well-established firms, draw some items from there, and perhaps add some items of your own, and develop that new scale, and then test its, establish its psychometric properties. That would be the way to go.
One comment. It's like a temporal thing is also there. So I understand context is a very complex phenomenon. So can you tell how to reduce that complexity? Shall we look at the most dominant factor within that particular context which is influencing? Because it's not that particular socio-cultural factor is in fact influencing that. There may be certain other variables and other factors also inbuilt in the context which are different. So which one to take? I mean, is there any thumb rule or is there any way to arrive at that? Since I'm new to research, I really struggle with this.
Well, you know, the great Wally Longschmidt, who was a pioneer of media research in South Africa, and this became, I think, from the 1960s onward, a pattern in practice for advertising research, called everybody a fellow sufferer. So we're all new, and we are all suffering in these environments. But the issue I would say to you, to come back and think a bit harder, I think, about what you've heard today, especially in these two presentations about theorizing. It is the bringing in of other theories into our work. It's the reaching into other disciplines and bringing them in, which allows us to see how context might be different or how something might influence something differently. And my point again is that when you start thinking about the assumptions that we all take culture to be assumed. We understand that certain beliefs are accepted, and we forget about them. And researchers in the United States or India or China or whatever are no different. So when theories are developed in those places, there are assumptions that may have been just not thought about. Think carefully about those things. And don't limit yourself to, I don't mean to suggest that Steenkamp and I have developed some overarching lock on what are contextual variables. You heard this morning from Professor Scheth about climate factors. There is no one way to think about this, but the ways that you think about it have to be relevant and make sense to your theory.
Yeah. May I add something? I think we're kind of a little bit old-fashioned. We are old. I think today, when we have Wikipedia, when you have social networks, we could use what is rightly or wrongly defined as crowd marketing as brain. That is, we could turn to people over the internet, over the social networks, and ask them. And if you get 1,000 or 3,000 answers, probably you'll have 3,000 brains working for you instead just of you sitting in your lonely room and breaking your heart and mind on some issues. Because, if you want to be trend changer, not continuer, you cannot just rely on what people wrote in 1990s or even in the 2000 or even 20 years ago. It's not enough. So that we have powerful tools we could use to increase our knowledge. And just look at Wikipedia as a good example that you get tons of data which nobody thought about it, and even the most smarter professors did not know about it, but some remote person really had this fact in his mind. So you have the brainstorms and the brainwash, and really I think here's where the qualitative type of research coming in, really to generate innovative and new ideas, and don't be afraid, even if it's different. Once you get this idea, then you have to polish it and to test it and to discuss it. So we have this enormous tool, and I'm sure in 3 or 4 years when we talk about market research, it will be a completely different ballgame.
Okay. Peter, you want to say something?
Yes, I just want to make
Then we'll have one more final question from Anil.
point on context in terms of data collection is, be careful when you are exploring how people make decisions that you're not taking it so far out of the context of how that decision is made that really you're stretching the credibility of the person you're asking. Like a decision which required very little thought, and 2 weeks later you're trying to probe that in a lot of detail, it's probable that the person cannot effectively answer you. Not because they don't necessarily had a reason at the time, they just either can't remember it, or it was so automatic in terms of their neurological mindset that they couldn't actually go back and tell you how they made that decision. And again, I think we're learning a lot more from neuroscience about the pitfalls of research methodologies which don't take into account the difference between the conscious and the subconscious brains. So I think that's another element of context, where you collect the data compared with how people make decisions.
Okay, let's have a final question.
Underlying assumption is we're talking of data, we're talking of advanced statistical techniques. But if you're really serious about finding new insights from the emerging markets, I think the qualitative research is going to lead the way. My simple question is, how do these top journals, and most of you being the editors of top journals, if a qualitative based research paper comes to you, do you consider it to be a rigorous paper? And what is the statistics of 100% paper getting published in top journals? How many of them do you think use the qualitative based approach?
Okay, I'm lucky I'm not an editor, so I don't have to explain to you why. But my feeling is that there is a bias towards more quantitative rather than qualitative, and probably because I think when people say qualitative data, they have this idea of, let's ask 5 people what they think, and I will tell you in my paper what I think they think that I think that they think, rather than having some more kind of structural, content analysis. So there are tools really to make qualitative data more rigorous. But I'm sure that maybe because we are to blame as an educators, we do not teach people and not train them in doing this type of data analysis. Students and PhDs may not be well acquainted, and the editors and the reviewers really have to reject it because it's just too weak to say that, I heard from. So, in the justice system, heard evidence is not acceptable. So you have to apply the same rule here. But maybe some of the editors will comment on that.
Since we are running short of time, let me just respond to that by saying, there is really no bias in favor of any particular methodology or any negative bias against any methodology. They all held to the same standards. But it's like I think Michael said, reason why we don't see that many qualitative studies is that they're not as rigorously done as are done the quantitative studies. So, and that is because the researchers are not well trained in terms of qualitative research methodology. And we have got many researchers who are well trained in terms of quantitative methodology. And that, but the same standards of rigor are applied to research using any methodology. Okay, folks, that's been very interesting. I do thank you for all your questions, comments, and certainly, all the panelists will be around throughout this conference, and If you have some questions which remain unanswered, I hope that you will take the opportunity to grab one of them and talk to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you, Professor Naresh. On behalf of IIM Lucknow, I would like to thank Professor Naresh Malhotra and all the distinguished speakers for sharing their valuable insights, which will definitely be useful to all the doctoral candidates in their future research endeavors. Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Just a small piece of information. We'll be beginning with the hall at 6:15 p.m.
What time?
6:15 p.m.
Of any sort. This is very much going to be a session where I talk, people making all intelligent comments. I was like wondering what is it that I'm going to say next. But it's just an honor and a privilege to be here. My introduction was rather brief because that's about what I've done in my life. If you notice, I am intentionally underplaying setting the context. You don't expect too much. I'm an engineer by background and then did my master's in marketing from Sydenham Institute of Management Studies in Bombay. That was about when some of you were still to be born. And since then, I've been pretty much in this industry, fascinating industry called marketing research. I've spent time on both sides of the table. I've been a buyer of research and a seller of research or a doer of research. So I have a perspective that I think there is some freshness that I can bring in the sense that how it works on the other side and how do we see things from the other side of the table. I'm backed with IMRB on the sell side of marketing research. And the reasons for that are various. So yeah, so like he said briefly, I started my career with a company called Lintas, which some of you might know, and then moved on to a marketing research company called TNS. I then moved on to Cyprus with a company called Nielsen, which is a marketing research firm, a fairly large one. From there, Nielsen, Dubai, and that's when I was at Dubai, I switched for the next 5 years. I was at a company called Do, which is a telecom startup in Dubai. It's a telecom service provider. I was there for 5 years, and now very recently, the last 7 months, I've been back in India with IMRB. Yeah? So that was about how interesting I could make it about myself. I have to switch this on. So like I said, I'm just going to give you a perspective of a little bit about, while I will get to the eventually to the point about qualitative and quantitative research, I just thought I'd spend a few minutes sharing what I think I could share, which might be interesting for some of you. And forgive me for all your, there was one other thing I decided I would say, and I will say it now. I just saw a lot of people who've come from far away lands, so welcome to India. And okay, so you've been through all of this. You've probably heard some better ways of people saying this, but this is how I would say it. It's a function which basically links the consumer to the marketing through information. That's as simple as it gets, yeah? This is the various ways you could use this information. You could generate, refine, and evaluate marketing actions. You could monitor marketing performance. Yeah, but what is the underlying piece of every marketing research is to eliminate risk or to reduce risk. You know, the fact remains that marketeers or research is telling them things which they didn't know of, they didn't think of, or don't entirely believe in. Yeah, so that is something which you need to bear in mind, which brings us back to the need of ensuring that the research that we do is just so sound that you can prove the reasons, with reasons, why you're saying what you're saying. Yeah? All right, that's the secondary objective. So we all know marketing research adds value, and I just have 2 nice pictures I found on the internet, so I thought I'd put them up. What this really is trying to say is that it works everywhere. It works when you have to take some certain strategic decisions. You know, when you have a 35,000 feet view and deciding how to climb that mountain and trying to do an aerial survey of how that works, you can use research to help you do that. And research can also help when you are on that mountain to help you find the shortest way to a particular, summit. That, that's what I'm trying to project here. So it is used in both ways. And you've been through this session for a while now, so you all agree that it's great, right? But here's what I've got. These are some very, very learned people like you have in the room, and some others have said some very interesting things about marketing research. Research is what I'm doing when I don't know what I'm doing. Advertising people who ignore research are as dangerous as generals who ignore decodes of enemy signals. So this is one in favor of marketing research. Yeah. This one I think is by Mr. Ogilvy. He says, I notice increasing reluctance on the part of marketing executives to use judgment. They are coming to rely too much on research, and they use it as a drunkard uses a lamppost for support rather than for elimination. Yeah, I hope you see the point about some of these quotes. Facts are stubborn, but statistics are more pliable. And we are more in the domain of providing, because it's sample-based, we never really do a census of any sort for any research. So there is always an argument for and against and this and that, and what is the statistical error of your sample and this and that, especially with qualitative research, which you will come to, it just complicates the whole thing a lot more. But anyway, this is a slide which you are not intended to read, but you can try. What I've tried to do here very quickly is to just show you a typical process of a marketing research. It starts with the marketing need, a decision. So there's a research brief, and the decision boxes that you will see there is I'm just building up, if you like, A, to use some airtime, so I don't have too many other clever things to say, and B, to also share with you what happens in real life. So this is how a typical, right from within IMRB or within the client side, when you have a marketing decision to take, you will issue a brief, yeah, a research brief. And there's a decision box there whether it has clear action standards, yes or no. Then there's a proposal, whether it meets client's needs, yes or no. If it does, then you move on to the tool. Is that optimal, yes or no? You collect that information. You go through the rest of the process of a research thing. And you ensure that the results are providing the clarity that they need, and you take a decision. Sounds right to everyone? This is how it should be done. This is how we've learned it at school. But in real life, you often find this. So what is this telling you? This is where the workshop starts. You're supposed to talk. So what is this telling you? It's the same process. What's missing? Anyone? Sorry? Yeah, the decision boxes. And are they important? They're absolutely important, right? Because and this is how I can tell you, a lot of the research that goes on in day-to-day life happens like this. They issue a brief, which is, and we'll come to how various briefs are. Then there is a proposal. They just go through the process as if it were, a conveyor belt churning out locks at the end of, rather than churning out research. Yeah. So this decision box. Why do people leave this out? Because those are the decision boxes that people are forced to think. Yeah. Think means time. Yeah. And people don't have the time. Either people don't want to think or they don't have the time for whatever reason. But the fact is that these boxes get missed. Yeah, and that is where our problems begin. Yes? And now I have coined a few syndromes that are to do with explaining each of these important steps, if you like, in the research process. So what are these syndromes? And these have been coined by me, so they are proprietary, but you can use them because no one will know you have. The first one is, oh my God syndrome. Now, what is this syndrome? Anyone? Take a guess. What is? It's against a marketing need decision. So what is a oh my God syndrome? When you say oh my God? It was meant to be a workshop, so I expect participation. You can take a wild guess. Sorry? Not really. Yeah, that's close. But actually, what really oh my God syndrome is, when I wrote it, was that I have an advertising that goes on air in 48 hours. I haven't tested it whether it works or not. Oh my God, let's do research. You know, let's do some research now. And this again, I just want to remind you, it happens every single day in day-to-day life. We get clients, and I was a client at some point in time, and I probably did the same thing. We get clients who say that, you know, we need this done in 7 days. You know, in 7 days, I'm not even going to be able to move from here to, you know, that point. But we have to do it in 7 days. So this is an oh my God syndrome. It always happens. Oh my God, you know, where is research? Either it's somebody's boss has said that, you know, I'm not doing this unless you have done, show me that there is research that has proven that what you're doing is right or wrong. Or somebody has, you know, the boss has decided this is the right thing, but the boss's boss is still skeptical. All of those things have come to play in the real life. So it's an oh my God syndrome. It's always last minute, very often last minute. And really, when it's last minute, like you do your projects last minute and you cram your for exams last minute, it's never the same if you've prepared well, right? And there is one which has clear action standards. And here is another syndrome. It's the skimpy brief syndrome. I mean, don't get any ideas here. What I mean by skimpy brief syndrome is the briefs that you get from client for you to do research have to really tell you what the marketing problem is, what is the decision that is going to be taken at the end of this problem for you to be able to design the right research. Yeah, we're talking about qualitative here and quantitative research here. There is a time and a place for every research tool to be used. Yeah, but very often you will get clients say, let's do focus groups. Why? What is the problem? What is the decision that you're going to take? This is again a syndrome which is, you know, it's almost an epidemic. Then there is a methodology. This is where this topic of today's subjects, quantification syndrome and exploration syndrome, you know. This is again, it fascinates me. I've been in the industry for over 15 years now. And you will find this, when you do a good piece of qualitative research and you dig some insights from consumers' minds and hearts and from wherever, and you go and tell clients that, you know, this is the piece of information we found, and they will say, how many people did you meet? You know, was it a statistically valid sample? And we are like, hello, you know, we can get there, but that was not what the intention of this particular study was. You know, on the other hand, you know, when it's quantification, every single thing, you know, I want to understand what consumer are calling or true to your research, then you have to at least guide your clients, like you said, and say that this is probably what you should do and you shouldn't do. Yeah, I'm not going to get a straitjacket syndrome yet, but this is to do with how you present results, but that's not really the point. Anybody again understands this symbol? Have you seen this symbol before? Yeah. This is where the creativity of a market research starts and ends. That is all you can do. And you will see this, it's a yin-yang. It's in Chinese philosophy, used to describe how polar opposites or seemingly contrary forces are interconnected and interdependent in the natural world and how they give rise to each other in turn. Don't ask me what that means, but that's what it says. Now in marketing research, you will find this nice little yin-yang used for every time that they combine qualitative research with quantitative research. Because as I said, market research professionals aren't entirely the most creative people. And so it's a nice, it looks nice, you know, it's one side is qual and the other side is quant, and it's all nicely integrated together. So that's how we, you know all this already, but very briefly, it's how much, how many, what, you know, the kind of questions that quant is supposed to answer. And the qualitative studies decide to provide insight why people do what they do. Yeah? This everyone knows. Now I'm coming to the point, finally I'm coming to the point of this presentation, which is trying to give you some clues about how we should guide our clients on when to use qualitative research versus quantitative research. Product development, for example. I mean, these are all live examples, live things that we do at IMRP. So it's just to it'll give you a good sense. And as we go along this, I will eventually take up one particular case where qualitative and quantitative are used together. So you'll see how it is used in action. And it probably worked for the client, which was me incidentally at that time. So in product development, you know, you have, and we do this all the time, and in concept development actually, sometimes the client, the R&D teams come up with a lot of options that they can do. Yeah. Now this comes to almost like a filtering process. So you put everything through a large sieve, and then you see what comes down through qualitative, in a smaller, more manageable thing, which we can then test for quantitatively. So this is again in practice very often used. So you will see how qualitative and quantitative in this scenario can work very well together. Yeah, you have, let's say, 40 product ideas or concept ideas. But you can only launch 3, or you want to know which 3 first. So instead of testing all 50, you will go through some qualitative process. You get the consumer's insight to tell you, help us prioritize these 50 ideas into buckets of 5, or in buckets of 10 in 5 piles, and prioritize them. So we do that all the time. Then there is branding. In brand development, again, in packaging and name generation, again, very often you will find qualitative is actually used to come up with names. See, the idea of a qualitative research is twofold. One is to test something with consumers, and 2 is also to get something from consumers. When you're testing something quantitatively, you're not really using the intelligence of the respondent. In qualitative research, the idea is actually to use the intelligence of the respondent as well to see what they come up with. Because if it's consumer speak and something has come up, I have this, this brand, what are the likely names? Because in an organization, you will probably have 150, 200 people in that space who can give you ideas. When you go to the TG who you think you're going to sell this to and try and look for names, you're actually getting ideas from the people you're selling it to. So you're actually picking their brains. Yeah? So that's an important component of qualitative research. It's not just to test something, but also to get something. I think that's the difference it's important to remember. There are some other, again, very similarly, arrive at positioning, need gap analysis. What do I mean by this is, again, you have, let's say in detergents, you have a whole lot of detergents. Everybody promises to make your clothes whitest. But is there something in the consumer's mind that they're actually differentiating? Positioning, as we all know, is not what the marketer thinks of his brand, but is what the consumers think of their brand, right? So qualitative research actually helps in bringing out those parameters that people use to differentiate from a Tide, from a Surf, or whatever else that may be. Yeah? And then you can use those to see whether there's a map that emerges. Are there attributes that the people are looking for in detergents which aren't occupied currently by a brand? And that's where the quantitative piece will come in. You follow? Am I going too fast or too slow maybe? Likewise, everything else. Yeah, you can read this about the brand again. And the reason I put this up is because I've been talking to people internally, and we've put together all, in the recent past, the various, there's a joke in the research industry that anytime the client wants, qualitative followed by quantitative. This is a standard methodology that we propose to all clients. In most cases, that's what it's needed. But, even what I'm trying to say is that while at IMRB there is always an endeavor to give the right tool to the client for the right job, business needs often will mean that people will pick up a proposal that was done in the past and try and do that for some, force fit that methodology for some other business need. And that is the danger we must avoid, either if you are buying research or you're selling research. Yeah?
Excuse me, just a question.
Yeah.
Going back to the previous slide, where you had brand extension, qualitative and quantitative.
Yeah.
Was it a mixed method research or separate research done at different points in time?
No, mixed. All of these cases that I've brought here are mixed. So there was a need, not very often you get to do interesting work on brand extensions, but you have a very powerful brand. Yeah, so like I said, that work that we're finding the areas that are extendable and brand values to be taken forward. So what is this? So the marketer has some ideas on what his brand can do, yeah? But before he does that and then says, okay, has this worked? Because his brand has certain equity in the market, he goes to his core TG or users of the brand and says that, okay, this is your brand, iPhone or whatever it is. What else do you think with this brand I can do? Can I sell a refrigerator? Probably people will say no, So you pick their brains to see what are the ways and means you can extend that brand. So you can leverage the equity that you built in one category in other categories.
So if I understand you correctly, the quantitative research was driven by the qualitative findings?
Yes. In most instances, yes. Like I said, in most instances you will find that the qualitative research precedes the quantitative research, because like I said, you generate certain ideas, hypotheses, which you will then want to test whether they hold any water. Yeah, because at the end of the day, the comfort with decision making very often comes with numbers. Yeah, and that because people will float the numbers a lot of the time. It's actually very interesting. The decision is very often made based on numbers, but what people often remember also is what the insight they got from the qualitative piece of work. Because that's always the more exciting, the more interesting, and the more closer to the consumer kind of work. Anyway, now let's get to the one particular case study, which incidentally for this one, it was a bit funny because I was the client for this one, and IMRB had done the study for us. So I can actually talk on both behalf. So this was the background. This was a new telecom player who was looking to find a space for itself in the crowded service provider space. Crowded as in there was only one other actually in that market. So in this instance, we first did what we call a market mapping study, because this market that I'm talking about is UAE. I think you have speakers from Dubai as well. So in this market, there's one legacy player called Etisalat who's been in the market for 30 years, and almost everybody and his dog had an Etisalat connection. Yes. So, but however, we had decided that we want to launch this new service provider. So what is it that we should do? So obviously it was the reason I used the word crowded, because Etisalat was so well entrenched. The penetration, mobile phone penetration at the time we entered the market was upward of 100%. So which says that there are more SIMs in the market than there are people. Yeah, so it was a tough challenge. The first thing that we did was to do a kind of a market mapping exercise, and to look at the core objective of that market mapping exercise was to identify, to see if there is a group of people who are likely, who are the most fed up of Etisalat, or the most and they're looking for an option. They feel trapped with what they have currently, and they're looking for an option. So we did this exercise, and we found that there was a particular segment called youth, which was large enough because as you all probably know, the Middle East has a very young population. So youth, it was a sizable segment of the market. It also made a lot of marketing sense, because if you get the youth, if you get 60-year-olds into your brand very early, it's all well, but then you're probably going to miss out on the a larger chunk who have the chance of staying with your brand for a longer time. So yeah, so that bit decided. We decided, okay, let's focus, let's position, or let's go after this segment and say that we target ourselves as being a youth brand. Yeah, and I can say that with some level of confidence that the research actually helped make this decision. But I also don't want to be too modest and say that probably it was already decided that we want to be a youth brand. So let's not get there. So yeah, so like I said, that bit decided that we now wanted to understand what the youth actually do, what their beliefs are, who their role models are, get an in-depth understanding. See, because when you're saying that you're going to sell something to a particular group of people, the first thing you need to know is to understand that group of people fully well, right? So, any guess what the methodology was used? Yeah, in this instance, actually, we did a qualitative and quantitative together, because there was nothing much that we needed to, form the qualitative that didn't go into the quant, because of the market mapping exercise that we had done initially. So we did a qualitative. So the objective of doing a qualitative and a quantitative research together, and to do both, was and the important point for you to understand is to get into, because we needed very hard numbers on what the youth does. What is it that they do? How much of money do they spend? How much of it is on mobile phones? What is the number of times do they recharge their phone in a week? What is the amount? What is the way they recharge their phone, and so on and so forth. So all of this information, the confidence will come from which piece of data? Anyone? No. What is the other option? Quantitative. I think let me start again. When we have to find out hard stuff like how much is it that they spend, what is the number of times they recharge in a week, how many SMSs do they send on an average, what is the average call, how much time do they spend talking to their friends on the phone, locally, internationally. So these things are important for us to get, right? And we can do qualitative interviews and say, yeah, I spend a lot of time with my phone. How much? 10, 15 minutes. And someone else will say 40 minutes. So, you will get some idea, but you will not get, because at the end of the day, you also have to make a plan, you have to make a product which you have to sell to the same group, right? So if you have to say that I will give discounts on local calls, yeah, and you, based on qualitative research, say, we know that on average people only talk 15 minutes, based on qualitative research, and you find out that they actually speak for 45 minutes, then your plan is gone. You got to, before we started up, we'd have to close down. Yes, so we have some of these decisions cannot be taken purely on qualitative piece of work. But having said that, there are a whole lot of other information that we needed that, and again, like I said, one of the first slides I said, and I don't want to go back to that because it will be a lot of, but it actually said marketing research actually helps improve the knowledge and the performance of the executives, Now this is a slightly softer or less tangible purpose of marketing research. When I say it helps build an organizational understanding of the consumer, I mean, someone might argue, yeah, basically you're just fluffing and not really saying much, but it's true. If you do enough of consumer understanding work, I mean, these days people actually, at least the good companies, believe in it, and you find a lot of marketing people who will do ethnographic work. They will do field visits almost every second week to go and speak to their consumers, which is all qualitative work, right? It helps them get a feel for the pulse of that consumer, and those kind of things you will only get from qualitative kind of work. Yeah. So anyway, we did qualitative and quantitative work. I actually went through this a little bit. I'm just going to touch upon the three main parts that there were a whole lot of things that we did, but I'm just going to focus on three main objectives that we had. So who is the youth? So one full understanding piece on what is it that they do. Yeah, let me try and get into, especially for someone like me, and most of my colleagues were either older or at the same age of mine. Relating to the youth itself is a big challenge. So that was important. I mean, we all have kids at home, but kids are not the universe, right? So this was important piece of thing. What is it that you do? What's a typical day? What do they dream about? Now you might turn around and say, well, how do you care as a marketer what you dream about? But there is, this, if you try and understand some of this information that you get, how you use it will actually flow directly from there. You don't always do a research, especially some pieces of research. Is actually good not to, I'm saying it's not that I'm going to try and look for these three things, especially in qualitative research. You need to go in with an open mind and say that I really honestly want to understand and get into the skin of my consumer and see what is it that is he or she does that is bothering her. And how you will use that information, you will then decide, right? Unlike in a quantitative piece of work, where you collect a lot of data, when you actually know that you're going to use this to either create verify an ad or do some product development and so on and so forth. So the three things I'm going to talk about is who is the youth today, so you get into all of that. How do they use their phones? Like I said initially, this was very, very important for us. Because if we have decided as a company to target this, our entire business case was built on, the extent of usage of these guys, right? What is their current extent of usage? What is the amount of money they spend? And that was an important piece. And what is their opinion of the brands? And are they likely to consider our brand? Yeah, so these are the three pieces of information I'm going to take. So who are the youth? So with this came out through some qualitative work. The first thing we found that the UAE market is quite unique because while for those of you who don't know, in the UAE only 20% of the population is local Emirati population. The rest is all expatriate. Now even within the youth, we found that in our mind, youth was one big bucket from 15 to 24 years. This actually is the first time it actually told us that we cannot look at them as one bucket. because attitudinally the beliefs are very different. The Emirati youth are different from the Asian youth. Yeah, the Asian youth are different from the Western youth, and they're all living together and staying together at some points. So, yeah. So we broadly put again through qualitative piece of work, that same work. There was some whole lot of that can't hardly be read, but anyway, you can read this. What this says that there are some groups which you call as affiliative, some were more conservative, some were more desire material pursuits. So we are actually now begun to, through the qualitative piece of work, trying to give a shape and form to some types of youth within the youth, if I'm making any sense. Yeah. Then we collected some important data, which was important. Again, some of these slides can't be read. This is about, on the left you see what is the amount of money. So money comes from parents whenever needed. How nice. 48% of them said that I get my money whenever I need. So this is again a very important piece of information for us, which actually tells us that while the youth and most of them, one of the data points was that they don't work. A lot, 90% of the youth in the UAE do not work. So unlike in the West, where you find that while they are taking a course, they will also probably taking up a job. In the UAE, where the cost of living is not really cheap, you still find a lot of them supported by their families. 50% of them were supported by families. And as a marketer, this information is great for me, because they know that that means that he's not really cutting corners when it comes to at least using his mobile phone. Because we have another qualitative data which says that, which will come up, mobile phone is my life. I will feel lost if my, these kind of attitudes exist. I mean, I don't think that's a very youth phenomena today, but it corroborated what we believed. Then there was another piece of information which showed you that, this is the spends. This is not just mobile spends, but all spends. You find that, again, this is no surprise, but at least give you some indicative figures on what is it that a typical youth. So on the bottom, the one that you can't read is 13 to 15, 16 to 18, 19 to 21, and 20 to 24. Yeah, so we've broken up the youth further into age brackets, and we found that who are the people who spend more or less than the others. We also found that the local Emiratis, they probably have a little bit more disposable income, and they are, they spend more than the Asian expats. Yeah. Okay, this is